Hello, everyone. My name is Annette Sandler, Director of Content Development at AVIXA, and welcome to Ask Away Lessons Learned in Live Events. So this Q&A session is dedicated to sharing ideas for tackling the challenges that are facing live event companies right now. Here to answer your questions today are Josh Weisberg, President of Navolo Audio Video, Matt Ward, Chief Technologist for World Stage, and Janae Mummert, Vice President of Business Development for Rentex. Today's Ask Away webinar will have a different format. Instead of presenting for the next 45 minutes, our speakers today have agreed to let you, the audience, drive the discussion. So that means that your questions will determine what we talk about today. Before I hand the mic over to our speakers, there are a few housekeeping items. This program will run for about 45 minutes and all attendees will be placed on mute. Please enter your questions into the Q&A window, which allows us to track which questions we've answered and which ones we have yet to get to. To access the Q&A window, move your cursor at the bottom of your live stream video box to locate the Q&A icon, and then you can type away. Having done quite a few of these webinars recently, my favorite programs have a robust chat conversation going. So in the spirit of our virtual conversation, please update your chat settings to send messages to panelists and attendees so that everyone who's on today can see your comments and your feedback in the chat window. You will have access to this recording at avixa.org/webinars within 5 to 7 business days. And because this program is Q&A based instead of presentation based, we are not offering RUs. So to start us off today, each of our speakers will share a little bit about their experience in the industry during other historic economic downturns, and then we'll dive right into your questions. As our panelists introduce themselves, please take a moment to introduce yourself through the chat by sharing your name, your company, and the biggest challenge that you're facing right now. And now I'd like to turn to our panelists. Janae, let's start with you. What were you doing during the Great Recession and other economic downturns before that?
Thanks. Hello, everybody. Well, in 2001, I was at Christie Digital, and that was certainly a trying time for everybody because they were extremely focused on installation as well as live events. We kind of managed to keep ourselves afloat with the installation business that was in the channel. So that was a fairly smooth ride. Now let's fast forward to 2007 and 2008, where I was at another very large sub-rental company, not Rentex. That was a little bit of a different story. And in that particular case, we had to very quickly look for another revenue stream. We were very fortunate that we found one, and it's one that actually stuck. So we're going to talk a little bit later about temporary revenue streams and revenue streams that we might continue on. This one continued on, and that just happened to be reality TV. At that particular point in time, people weren't required to social distance or anything like we're doing right now. So people were staying at home. So good, or at least perceived good, cheap television was very popular, and reality TV kind of came into itself during that particular point in time. So we were very lucky to find that revenue stream. But some other things that we did that I'm implementing now are you kind of take a look and say, how many times have you said, and we never really thought it would happen, but gee, if we weren't so busy, we could get this done or that done. Well, be careful what you ask for, right? Because that's actually happened right now. But if you do look at things like inventory, taking a step back and looking at your processes, if you are planning on implementing any new applications, whether it's in accounting or, in our case, in the rental software, if you've got the cash to do that stuff right now, it's kind of like instead of fixing the race car during the race, you're doing it offline. So it's really hard to fix that race car while you're going 90 miles an hour. But right now, I don't think any of us are. So if you've got the money and you can do some of those things, this would be a really good time to do that as well. So that's kind of where I was and kind of where we're going now. And I think we're ready to talk to either Josh or Matt.
Thanks, Janae. Matt, let's go to you.
So, yeah, I had very different experiences. I quit my previous AV industry job on September 10th, 2001. When my wife was 7 months pregnant. It's a very interesting moment to decide to quit your job. The economy was a little bit soft at that point, but obviously the next day, live production sort of disappeared for a bit of time, and that turned out to be a great time to actually build a small rental and staging company and start a hardware company the next year. So I started Techamaki in 2002 and then started Element Labs in 2003. Coming out of those sorts of moments is a good time to scale something new because, well, for a lot of the same reasons that Janae mentioned, you're not doing 50 shows at once. You've got 1, 2, 3 clients. You're introducing things that are easily digestible. And you know where all the moving pieces are because they're all in your head because you don't have 20, 40, 100 employees. Move on to the next side of it, which is 2008 financial crisis. I was moving from Element Labs back into Techamaki at that point, but the financial crisis really sort of destroyed Element Labs. A lot of the big install projects in the Middle East vaporized, and the company's future was kind of closely tied to those events. So within 2 years, that got sold off to Barco. But from the Techamaki point of view, we had a bunch of install work. And I should say Element Labs got sold to Barco in 2010. I left in 2008. But the install work, the rental work was all okay. Actually, Techamaki had a great couple of years during that time, partially because we had a mix of clients. So I've generally had okay experiences with downturns, except for that whole Element Labs going out of business thing.
Hi, Matt, and everybody else. It's nice to see so many friends on the attendees there in the chat. Hi, I'm Josh Weisberg. I'm president of my sole consulting firm called Novolo Audio Video, but many of you may know me as the former president of Scharf Weisberg and then World Stage. So my history goes back a little bit further than my other co-panelists. I guess that means I'm the oldest one. But I'd start the story in 1976 when I graduated from high school. In 1976, the New York Daily News ran a cover story in huge bold type. It said, "Ford to New York, drop dead." And what that alluded to was President Ford turning down the request from New York City for additional funding, and it forced the city into bankruptcy. So I started my business life coming out of high school into a New York that was within, possessed by years of continuous decline in public and social services, suburban flight, rising crime rates, and that's the business environment that I joined when I was young. But you don't know what you don't know at that time, and survival instincts kick in. So you do what you can do, and you kind of figure it out. And it was, in some ways, it was a baptism by fire. It was survival of the fittest. And we survived. And I think part of that was following paths that aligned with our passions. And while we were looking for pots of gold at the end of soot-covered rainbows. But we formed the company in 1979, my former partner, Peter Scharf. I came in 1980. And then the 80s were boom years, if those of you remember. MTV came to be, ESPN came to be, and all of a sudden we had these, not the three big networks clamoring for gear and technical services. So it was very go-go. We hit the savings and loan junk bond crisis at the end of the decade, and that wiped a lot away. My partner and I had sold the company to a larger company before that downturn. When the downturn happened, we bought it back, and we started again. And I think that that's kind of an important factor for all of us to remember during this time, is that folding it up and starting again is a very legitimate path to take. This is the path that we took back in 1990. And then we rode another boom through the 90s, the dot-com boom, I guess you would call it. And it was very good for us. We were very successful. And then in 2000, the dot-com bust started to happen. Our business was centered in New York, so we had 9/11 to contend with. But in my memory, and I may be looking at this through rose-colored glasses, but my memory is that the 9/11 passed pretty quickly, even being in New York. Part of that, I think, was that our business was pretty diverse, and we had some recession-proof markets that we were dealing with that were recession-proof at the time. For example, the Broadway theatrical market, which we had moved into, broadcast production. In a recession, people still watch television. Janae mentioned this before. People still watch television. They will still go to a Broadway show or a concert. So we recovered through the early aughts, and then merged the company with Video Applications in 2007, became World Stage, and a year later, the recession hit. And as difficult as the recession was, having gotten through it, I look back on it and think it was a very important ingredient to our success after the recession, because what it enabled us to do is step back, trim expenses, become more streamlined, work on process, think about who we are, what we wanted to be, and how we were going to create that. And then again, helped by being involved in a number of different markets. As the businesses started to come back online, we were poised to take advantage of that. So 2010 was one of our most successful years ever, because the business really picked up and our expenses hadn't risen from the decline that we had put in place during the recession. So as informative as that is, obviously what we're dealing with now is extremely different. And I don't need to belabor the details. Everybody knows what's going on. But it does make me think about how we survive. And the way I think about it is we're almost in hibernation now. And for the most part, we're going to crawl into our caves. We're going to survive the winter. We're going to get really, really lean and really, really thin. But when we come out, we're going to come out to a world that's changed. It's going to be different than what was before. And we have to think about what that's going to mean for us as business owners, as employers, as employees, as freelancers. And some companies will not survive, but that doesn't mean there's not going to be rebirth from the ashes of what was. So I think that's some of the things we need to talk about today is, what is that rebirth? How can we change our companies? How can we change our approach? What are the opportunities that are there? And there will be opportunities for the people that are smart enough, motivated enough, passionate enough, and imaginative enough to think about what those are.
Thanks, Josh. And we have a question for you from Neville. And
Hi, Neville.
it sounds like your experience of being great, then bad, then great again is typical of a lot of rental and staging firms. Can you think of a way where somehow the industry could smooth out the massive peaks and troughs? And how many more times are we all going to go through this pain. So Josh, if you could solve all of our problems, that would be great. But I know from talking with you, one of the things that you guys did at World Stage was diversify into various different business and service areas. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that, which does help to weather the ups and downs of business.
Sure. Hi, Neville. Great question. I think, to some extent, we've been in boom and bust economies since the 1700s, maybe 1600s. And I don't see that changing, but I think there are things you can do within your company and your organization to weather that better. One is always expect that the bust is going to come. And I think that coming into this catastrophe, I don't know, I was kind of thinking, boy, it's been a lot of years without an economic downturn. It's got to happen at some point. So, keeping some dry powder aside for those days, I think is really important. So as much as you feel like you need to grow your business and you need to get bigger, or you need to do more things, always have a backup plan that you can exercise if those things don't work out. The other thing is, I think diversity is important. I think being agile and being able to pivot your business becomes really important. Example I would give is back to 9/11. So at 9/11, we actually watched the Twin Towers fall from the window of our shop. And we looked at that and we said, our lives will never be the same, which they weren't. And I gathered the staff together that day or the day later, and I said, look, we're in this together. We got to figure this out together. We went to our whiteboard and wiped off every event that we were scheduled to do for 8 weeks. So we had 8 weeks of revenue just disappear immediately. Fortunately, at that time, we were also running a systems integration business and design build shop, and we had a number of big projects that were taking place. And I think we were very fortunate that we had a workforce that we could say, look, I know you guys and gals have been staging people, and I know that your passion is to do shows. We don't have any shows to do. How do you feel about going down to this store where we're installing this crazy system and putting wire, soldering wire to a rack? And again, we were fortunate that we had a workforce that said, whatever we got to do, let's do it. So I think being agile, being able to pivot becomes really important, and that helps smooth over those bumps.
Matt, do you have anything you want to add to that? I know at Takamaki you did some of the same, some rental and staging business and some installs.
Yeah, I mean, we saw, particularly after 2008, and Takamaki was Northern California based, now part of World Stage. And we saw our event business sort of tail off, but we had a couple good-sized install jobs. And we were a small company. We were able to sort of reorient around the work we had. I mean, as with our equipment, so goes our business, where we live within other people's business cycles. We're attached to them. A lot of our sort of boom and bust that we've had now is much bigger than our industry. And we're not going to have an impact on that. You need to adapt to that environment, because we're not going to, the chief of the Fed, Josh Weisberg, cannot step in and fix what's going on in the larger economy around us. We have to be flexible and aware of what's going on around us and aware of opportunities. I mean, we should be aware of opportunities during the good times. It's just that it's obviously far more important when a big chunk of your live production business suddenly goes away. So we've always done that, but we've also always looked at these moments when all of that falls away as a time to look at what's going to change. A lot of times after these big economic downturns, I mean, reality TV is a good example, but there's also been new hardware businesses that have grown up. The dry hire business expanded massively after one of these downturns. There's structural changes in our business, and it's just, you got to look at what's going on around you and, you know, try to make the right decisions.
And Janae, I know we have a comment from Barry that the key difference with this situation is that it combines both the economy and health concerns. And so you talked about reality TV. Where do you start looking on the business development for temporary revenue streams when you're faced with something like this?
Well, the first place I actually start looking is the news. It may sound a little bit silly, but you know, one of the things that I try to look at always, but you know, I think like Matt just said, even more so now when business development is in some cases the only business you have is developing new business. So I look at the news, and I look at the news to see what people are doing and what they need, and then we sit back and say, all right, let's write these things down and see how that fits with what do we own, you know, what can we own, what talent do we have, and what kind of infrastructure do we have. And then we try to come up with some ideas that would either be permanent or maybe temporary. We don't have the facility to make masks, for example, but some companies do. I would assume that, you know, for some of them, that's going to be a temporary business for them. What we're looking at right now is we looked at schools. Schools needed more computers, more laptops, more things are being done remotely. So we certainly have focused a little bit on that to make sure that they get dry hire what they need. We're not willing to cross over and go into actually setting up events or competing with our clients. That's a fine line that we walk as a dry hire rental company. We walk it every day, just like a tightrope. Thank you, Josh. I appreciate the thumbs up. We will not cross that line as long as I'm breathing. I can promise you that. But we did look at some dry hire options, and obviously our traditional people are either they're not busy, or they're slow enough that they don't really need us. So we looked on the news to see what people are doing, and we've kind of gone there. We've reached out to some of the people that are doing temporary, you know, hospital facilities, because if you're doing that, what do you need? You need printers. You need, you know, you're not just bringing people in and not keeping any record of it. You need computers to keep track of that. So again, we're just looking around us and seeing what's happening, what people need and trying to see how that fits into our business model.
I also think one of the things we're already getting from some clients is, what are our plans in terms of the on-site aspect of this? What is our health and safety plan? And this isn't the health and safety plan like the mics have to be washed off, like you need to sanitize. That's not that. What we're talking about is how people enter a building, how many people can be in the building. You know, what sort of routes do people take once you arrive within the building to sort of spread people out? I think people are starting to look at the logistics of every part of the process to figure out, you know, if we're going to do a live show again, how do you minimize the number of people? How do you spread them out? How do you decentralize them? You know, it's just we're going to have to rethink things for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, and an interesting place to look for the panelists and the attendees is the CEO of Wynn Resorts put forth a plan, basically their opening plan. And it's an extremely comprehensive document. It's many, many pages. And it outlines what their planning is in terms of opening up the casino resorts, how to handle not only guests, but how to handle cleaning and food preparation, the live theater for theater people that are part of this group today, I thought it was very interesting that they are planning on opening their theater when the casino opens. And your thinking is like, how are they going to do that? Well, I think the theater seats something like 1,600 people. They're only going to sell 600 tickets a show. And they are going to separate the attendees by rows and aisles and make sure that there are only small groups of people sitting together. Is that plan going to work or not? Don't know, but it's worthwhile taking a look and seeing what they're thinking about and how that might relate to how we're running our businesses.
One of the things we've had to address too that is definitely a business concern for us is the fears and even possibly going as far as saying paranoias of even our own employees, and addressing that with them and trying to really talk everybody off the ledge, for lack of a better term. You know, we have drivers that don't want to deliver. Right now we don't have much for them to deliver, so it's not a problem. But when we get busy again, you know, if you have drivers that don't want to have contact with people, you know, that's a concern. And I think those are concerns that are probably not rational, but we need to come up with, you know, PPE for them, and also just dialogue with them to make sure that they're comfortable. There is, you know, fear and paranoia are rampant right now, and I think as leaders in our companies, we need to step up and try to be the voice of reason. We certainly don't want to poo-poo anything or discount anything, but we can also hopefully stop some of the paranoia within our own organization.
Yeah, Janae, I think you hit on one of the questions that we got from Stephen. And I'll put this out. I think I'll put this out to Matt, since you were just talking about this. How do you see long-term effects from social distancing and new sanitation standards affecting the logistics of live events? So the load in and load out, productions in trucks, limitations on crew sizes, and then working with the facility that has their own additional standards, or ensuring that the facility is to a level of standard that your team is comfortable with.
Well, I definitely think that's an added element to logistics that, you know, as people go through their checklist for their live events, that will be a new category. Because you're right, we all are going to come up with our own guidelines and our own standards, but we don't execute our events or deliver our equipment, in our case, to our own buildings. We deliver them to people that have other standards. So there's going to be a lot of coordination and communication that's needed as far as that goes too, so that you're meeting the standards of the venues that you're going into.
Yeah, I can see issues with actually harmonizing these standards, because it's not just going to be the venue. It's going to be the client. If it's a touring artist, they may have their own health and safety, which isn't like what the venue's doing. We're probably going to have months and months of overlapping, not exactly identical standards. So developing a standard within our side of the industry would probably be helpful. Something that could be applied broadly that maybe other people could buy into. Because otherwise you're going to get convention centers and cities and specific clients everybody having their own standards, whether that includes PPE or quarantining the truck for 48 hours or having the room basically closed for a day and sanitized between the end of installation and the arrival of attendees. I mean, there's tons of arbitrary kind of safety theater things that people are going to do, and then there's things that people are going to do that are actually going to directly contribute to safety, like removing a lot of touch surfaces in sort of food service areas and things like that. Like high touch things like handles are, you know, an issue. So I think it's fixing the real stuff rather than sort of the typical safety theater that we see from larger organizations.
Yeah, I think there's another aspect of that, which is that I think we'll see some type of certification for people working, whether they're working backstage, whether they're performers. I go back to my memories of the AIDS crisis, frankly, and I wasn't working in this business, but I was aware of it. And that in the pornographic film business during the AIDS crisis, you needed a certification to work. And those certifications were self-administered by the trade, but they were extremely effective, and there was virtually no spread. And I think that we'll see something similar to that taking place in our industry and many industries, where when you show up on job site, you'll have to have, you know, a certification app on your phone that says you've been tested within a certain amount of time. And even still, they'll take your temperature. So that's one of the things that we're seeing, is that many job sites will have active temperature taking facilities. And if you've got a fever of 99.5, you're off the job. So that's a whole other level of how do you deal with the uncertainty of who your crew is going to be.
We've gotten a couple of questions from the audience on remote technologies. And Josh, I'll start with you. Do you see 3D hologram streaming growing in the business?
I really think Matt should answer that question. You see, he just ducked out.
But I went through so much trouble to direct it to you, Josh.
Yeah, holograms. I don't think so, frankly. I think that people are going to find other methods for creating life impressions on stage. I'm not sure that holograms are the right way to do it. Frankly, and I think that, you know, if you think about how we're consuming content today, which is typically over television sets and computers, we want to see people, and we don't want to see a hazy image of a performer who died 30 years ago. I don't think that's going to be the replacement. I'm hearing a lot of anecdotal positivity about some of the online performances that are taking place. And I think that that's a place to grow. You know, frankly, I would rather see 4 of my favorite performers performing together in their individual living rooms, doing something fun and spontaneous, versus seeing some canned show of a performer, like I said, who passed away a long time ago.
Yeah, the issue you get with the people playing music together online is the ensemble performance threshold, which is a thing, 25 milliseconds. Musicians, if there's more latency than that, musicians can't really effectively play together. But what you can do is build on top of things and layer things. Sam Cannon on Instagram is doing these performance pieces where she's collaborating with a musician or a musician and a dancer, and then she's doing work on top of them visually. And so you're taking these bits that are all arriving at the same time and sort of building up something on top of them. You know, I think it's one of these, that's one of the opportunities, like the person who figures that out, how you can actually turn this into an effective medium, will have something. But historically, the sort of holographic Pepper's Ghost sort of approach to this, I don't think solves the problem of an audience that's essentially dispersed for the near term. You know, a sort of a phantom performing on stage doesn't give us something we don't already have in front of our screens at home. So, yeah, not seeing it.
So to some other remote options, we have a question from Stephen. How can AV viewers support current live events with multiple remote performers to a totally remote audience. I think we've all seen the news shows and the late night shows that are doing some things from home. We're going to see more of this, and is there something that AV can contribute to that?
Yeah, and my Sam Canning comment was actually intended for Stephen's comment in chat. That comment made me think of what Sam was doing in terms of, because I think you mentioned college performances and things like that. And it's a lot of this isn't necessarily getting people in some virtual space. Some of it is interacting together live to create entirely new things.
Yeah, you know, I think that the remote aspect of the event business is here, and it's not going anywhere. That's going to be one of the it's what so, in that moving forward, every event, whether it's a musical performance, whether it's a keynote speech, whether it's a new product intro, is going to have some type of a remote element to it, bi-directional remote element to it. I think within the last 5 years or so, event professionals have gotten used to the fact that every event that they're involved with is probably going to be webcast or narrowcast. Well, I think we're also going to have to get used to the fact that every event we get involved with is going to have remote presenters, is going to have remote performers, is going to have a very significant pre-taped component. And to address some of the questions is that's what people need to be thinking about now in the industry. That's what the technicians need to be thinking about, is how do we incorporate these things into our regular workflows? And part of that is, if we're going to be bringing in all these people remotely, what's our quality threshold? You know, is what we're seeing here, is that the threshold? Is that going to be okay? I don't think so. I think that as AV professionals, we can do a lot better than what we're seeing right here. Not that, you know, my co-panelists aren't brilliant people, but, you know, it's the presentation. And how is that going to happen? And how as AV professionals are we going to elevate those remote presentations, remote performances to a level that people will be comfortable paying for?
I agree with Josh. I also think the way we integrate, the way we blend everything, whoever does that really well is going to come out ahead. If you look at the house of worship market, churches for quite some time now have had remote campuses. And basically the main event, whatever you want to call that, you know, obviously it's the sermon in a church environment, but call it whatever you want. That is streamed in from wherever. But they have these little mini campuses, you know, throughout the city, throughout the country, wherever they may be, where you have, instead of 5,000 people, maybe you have 100 people in each one. And, you know, it could even be smaller than that. So they get some of that live interaction for the smaller pieces of it. Maybe they have their coffee and donuts locally, you know, whatever, but they do get the main, you know, the main entertainment, the main speech comes piped in from somewhere else. I think that's important to remember, that as soon as we get through this immediate crisis and there is some interaction allowed, maybe these people all have masks on, maybe they'll all be wearing gloves. But I do think at some point you need to, everybody just doesn't want to sit in a chair 6 feet away from somebody else and look at something on the screen. There is going to be some element of making that interesting for the people that are there live and in person as well.
Janae, we had a question from Eric, because he's in New Orleans, where a majority of their revenue relies on tourism. Their mayor's recommending all events be canceled for the rest of 2020. So I think what you're saying ties in pretty nicely with this. How can AV companies refocus on maximizing opportunities within their home communities?
Well, I think they'll definitely have to refocus, and certainly a large declaration like that from the mayor of a major show city is a little bit devastating, honestly. But you do have to work with it and work around. So I would say doing what we just talked about, taking local companies, perhaps companies in your region, and giving them options where they can have 20 or 30 people together, but still make that interesting. Have food. You can have food. You can have catering there. You can do it smaller and keep people in smaller groups. But the statement from the mayor of a big city like that, that's a tough one. And I wish I had the magic wand to make that just go away. I don't, but you need to certainly focus on some of your local companies that can have regional meetings and still do things remotely and make them interesting.
Yeah, if I can add on to that, Janae, I'm in New York City, and obviously we're a tourist capital. That's one of the reasons why New York became such a hot spot. I was walking around, and all through the end of February, early March, mid-March, there were tens of thousands of tourists walking around, and the virus couldn't, that's sort of like a petri dish for the virus. And we're hearing things like Broadway is going to open up in the fall. I think a realistic point of view for people in the live event business is there's going to be no live event business in 2020. It's done. I think that you have to think about how am I going to get through this year with an understanding that the live event business really isn't going to come back this year. I think 2021 is going to be a rebuilding year. That's when you're going to start to see facilities figuring things out and meetings actually start to happen. But I think for 2020, we've got to assume that meetings, concerts, performances, theatrical productions are going to be rarities if they happen at all. And how are you going to get from today until next year intact?
Yeah, I'm with you on this one. That's a really devastating thing to hear. I know as a live events producer, certainly it's been challenging to pivot all of our stuff to virtual, as well as just sad to know that, the reason I do my job to go out there and be at a live event, we're not going to have that for a while. So I think everyone's certainly feeling some of that. I think we have time for one more question. I like this question from Allie. I think this might be a good one. The late night news shows that we talked about before, some people are filming episodes entirely on their phones. Contributors are certainly coming in, concerts and musical performances being recorded on phones and on webcams and all that stuff. And the general public is getting a lot smarter about audio and video options, since that's all they have right now. What do you think things are going to look like when we are meeting again, when we are having entertainment events again? Do you think that people will be turning to AV companies as the experts, or is there going to be a lot more do-it-yourselfers out there? So let's start with Josh for that one, but I'd love to hear from everybody on it.
It's a great question, Allie, because you're wrong. And I'll tell you why. Stephen Colbert has a broadcast truck parked in his driveway. He is not broadcasting his show from his iPhone. And that's the same as the others. Trevor Noah has a 2 or 3 camera broadcast setup in his house. That's what he's using. So I think one of the disservices that we're doing to ourselves as an industry is we're not saying, this isn't just as easy as setting up your iPhone. To do it right, you have to have expertise. And I think that is one of the perhaps lights at the end of the tunnel, is that when we get there, the expertise of the AV community is going to be more important than ever, because those meetings, those performances are going to be more complicated to do, particularly with the reliance on a remote audience or remote performers or presenters. And it's not as easy as calling into with your iPhone. I think people are going to get very tired of, I can't really hear that person. Why does that person look so mushy? They're going to want production values, and the AV community is going to have to be able to supply them.
I agree completely with Josh, and I actually have I have a slide in a PowerPoint presentation that I teach primarily to some of our hotel AV clients, but you have to provide people a better quality than what they can get at home. And that applied a year ago, and it'll apply a year from now. If they're paying you to do an event, a production, whether it's in person or remote, it has to be better than what they can get in their own living room. And I think this just raises the bar for us for the remote type events, and the bar has always been raised as far as anything in person, that we have to do better than what they can get at home.
Yeah, I'll be the contrarian and say, or it can be different, and that's the unknown. I mean, there's certainly gaps. There was a question about AR and VR for certain markets, for certain things. You might be able to create an experience on, let's say, one of the new iPads with the LiDAR that you can't really get in a theater, that you can't get live. It's a different thing. There's certainly windows. It's just somebody needs to, there's got to be a first person to take the risk and do it. And that's always, it's a risk. You can fail. You almost certainly will fail. But there's definitely opportunities there. But yeah, these late night shows, if you looked at the Saturday Night Live thing with Tom Hanks, that was definitely not just a spouse with an iPhone.
Well, thank you all so much. And thank you to our attendees for joining today's webinar, for trying something new with us. We recorded this. It's going to be up on avixa.org/webinar in about 5 business days. So thank you again to Josh, Matt, and Janae for answering all your questions today. We look forward to talking with you soon. We hope you enjoyed the program and have a great rest of your day.
Bye, everybody. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.